Public Works Steampunk presents Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte, with steampunk additions by R.A. Harding. Read by Danita Feldman.
Chapter 5, in which Jane embarks on a journey. 5 o'clock had hardly struck on the morning of the 19th of May when Bessie brought a candle into my closet and found me already up and nearly dressed. I had risen half an hour before her entrance and had washed my face, repinned my hair away from my temples, applied a few drops of oil to my ocular gears, and put on my clothes by the light of a half-moon just setting, whose rays streamed through the narrow window near my crib. I was to leave Gateshead that day by a coach which passed the lodge gates at 6 a.m, and that evening be transferred to the care of an airship that would take me the rest of the way to India. Bessie was the only person yet risen. She had lit a fire in the nursery, where she now proceeded to make my breakfast. Few children can eat when excited with the thoughts of a journey, nor could I. Bessie, having pressed me in vain to take a few spoonfuls of the boiled milk and bread she had prepared for me, wrapped up some biscuits in a paper and put them into my bag. Then she helped me on with my pelisse and bonnet, which was designed to cover the gears to keep them warm but not hinder their movement. And wrapping herself in a shawl, she and I left the nursery. As we passed Mrs. Reed's bedroom, she said, "Will you go in and bid Mrs. goodbye?" "No, Bessie. She came to my crib late last night when you were gone down to supper, and said I need not disturb her in the morning, or my cousins either. And she told me to remember that she had always been my best friend, and to speak of her and be grateful to her accordingly." "What did you say, miss?" "Nothing. I covered my face with the bedclothes and turned from her to the wall." "That was wrong, Miss Jane." "It was quite right, Bessie. Your missus has not been my friend, she has been my foe." "Oh, Miss Jane, don't say so." "Goodbye to Gateshead," cried I, as we passed through the hall and went out at the front door. The moon was set, and it was very dark. Bessie carried a lantern, whose light glanced on wet steps and gravel roads sodden by a recent rain. Chill was the morning. My teeth chattered as I hastened down the drive. There was a light in the porter's lodge. When we reached it, we found the porter's wife just kindling her fire. My trunk, which had been carried down the evening before, stood corded at the door. The manor had lowered itself to meet the edge of the road and was resting on its pylons. Without the engines thrumming to keep us aloft, the morning held a deep and solemn quiet. It wanted but a few minutes of 6, and shortly after that hour had struck, the distant roll of wheels announced the coming coach. I went to the door and watched its lamps approach rapidly through the gloom. "She going by herself?" asked the porter's wife. "Yes." "And how far is it?" 4,000 miles, a coach ride, a day and a half by dirigible, and then another carriage ride to the school." "What a long way. I wonder Mrs. Reed is not afraid to trust her so far alone." The coach drew up. There it was at the gates, with its 4 horses and its top laden with passengers. The guard and coachman loudly urged haste. My trunk was hoisted up. I was taken from Bessie's neck, to which I clung with kisses. "Be sure and take good care of her," cried she to the guard as he lifted me into the inside. "Aye, aye," was the answer. The door was slapped to. A voice exclaimed, "All right," and on we drove. Thus was I severed from Bessie and Gateshead, thus whirled away to unknown, and as I then deemed, remote and mysterious regions. I remember but little of the first ride of the journey. I only know that the day seemed to me of a preternatural length, and that we appeared to travel over hundreds of miles of road as the sun rose and began to travel overhead, though the day was grey with cloud and fog. We passed through several towns, and in one, a very large one, the coach stopped. The horses were taken out, and the passengers alighted. It was here the coachman escorted me to a tall building, and after ensuring that my luggage would be transferred properly, walked with me up the many flights of steps to the gangplank leading to the dirigible. I had seen smaller airships come and go from Gateshead Manor, but this airship seemed even bigger than the manor house. The stretched canvas over ribs puffed in and out as the ship gently bobbed up and down beneath the balloon. The many ropes that held it tethered in place made it look like an enormous fly that had been caught by a spider. I took a tentative step onto the plank between the tower and the airship, and grasping the rope railings, I made my way across to a porter who welcomed me and showed me to the dining room. But as I had no appetite despite him trying to tempt me with sweetbread and milk, he showed me to my place in the passenger section and left me sitting on a hard wooden seat near a window. It was from this vantage point I could see through the mist some of the tops of the houses and make out the comings and goings of some of the townsfolk. They moved slowly, and with the glass between me and the events, it felt like I was looking at ghosts moving in an underworld. The thought of the underworld brought back the chilling moments in the Red Room, and I dared not look out the window again until I felt the engines begin to thrum, and the airship began to move. It was my first time flying, to my young memory, in such a wondrous machine, and at that altitude. I once again turned towards the windows and glimpsed tops of buildings, stacked chimneys, church steeples and temple domes as we rose above the fog. I could see the city spread out before me in miniature and felt like Gulliver when he stood above the town of Lilliput. We soon passed through a second layer of clouds, and for a time the windows were a shimmering pearlescent. Some passengers exclaiming this must be what the gateway to heaven and the realms of the gods looked like. We ascended through that layer, and then it was the bright light of the sun over the white field of clouds that seemed to stretch forever. At times, a glimmer of the sea far below could be seen, but I soon grew tired of this, and lulled by the sound of the dirigible engines, I at last dropped to sleep. I was woken by a gloved hand on my shoulder, and saw that the sun had set and the scene outside my window was naught but shadows and darkness. The porter was offering me a blanket, but seeing my sleep-heavy confusion, he tucked it round me and turned the gas lamps low in the passenger section. The deep thrumming of the propellers reminded me of the engines at Gateshead, and I soon again slept. The early light woke me, and I was blessed with the sight of the sun rising over the clouds, looking like great hills heaving up around the horizon. While my naked eye could only see and marvel at the light, the ticking and whirring of my mechanical eye showed me the intricate wonders of the sky, the curved shadow of the earth being swept away by the sun's great light, the birds' marvellous shifting colours as they swept across the rosy sky, a dazzling sight to my young mind. The day progressed steadily, and I had very little to do. I had not been allowed to take a book, so I entertained myself looking out the window, catching glimpses of the world below. The porters once or twice guided me to the privy and offered me food, but I was unable to eat more than a few bites. The day passed, and the evening darkness once again enclosed the balloon. I drifted asleep, and had not long slumbered when the sudden cessation of motion awoke me, and those around me began to gather their belongings and move to disembark. I was unsure what I was to do when the porter came to the passenger section. "Is there a little girl called Jane Eyre?" I nodded and was told to follow. The porter guided me through the corridors, out and across the gangplank, and a person like a servant was standing at it. I saw her face and dress by the light of the lamps. "Jane Eyre?" she asked. I answered yes, and walked across the plank to meet her. My trunk was handed across to a man who was also waiting with us. We descended some stairs, and I was put into a carriage just as the airship, which must have completed the change in passengers, started the great propellers and swept away. I was stiff with long sitting, and bewildered with the noise and motion of the airship receding into darkness. Gathering my faculties, I looked about me. Warm rain, wind, and darkness filled the air. Nevertheless, the carriage was dry, and began moving at a quick pace for the space of about an hour, which seemed filled with new sounds and smells, though I could see little through the darkened windows. When the motion finally ceased, The woman encouraged me to step from the carriage and into the warm rain. I dimly discerned a wall before me and a door open in it. Through this door I passed with my new guide. She shut and locked it behind her. I could not see anything except what light was thrown by the lantern the woman held. There were stone steps and walls, a smell of damp as we made our way down to another door and out into the night. There was now visible a house or houses, for the building spread far. With many windows and lights burning in some, we went up a broad pebbly path splashing wet and were admitted at a door. Then the servant led me through a passage into a room with a fire, where she left me alone. I removed my cloak as it was damp and heavy, as well as the temperature being warmer than it had been at Gateshead. I stood and tried to dry my wet fingers over the blaze, then looked around. There was no candle or gas lamp, but the uncertain light from the hearth showed by intervals papered walls, carpet, curtains, shining mahogany furniture. It was a parlour, not so spacious or splendid as the drawing-room at Gateshead, but comfortable enough. I was puzzling to make out the subject of a picture on the wall when the door opened and an individual carrying a light entered. Another followed close behind. The first was a tall lady with dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin, and large forehead. Her figure was partly enveloped in a shawl. Her countenance was grave, her bearing erect. "The child is very young to be sent alone," said she, putting her oil lamp down on the table. She considered me attentively for a minute or two, then further added, "She had better be put to bed soon. She looks tired. Are you tired?" she asked, placing her hand on my shoulder. "A little, ma'am." "And hungry too, no doubt. Let her have some supper before she goes to bed, Miss Miller. Is this the first time you have left your parents to come to school?" I explained to her that I had no parents. She inquired how long they had been dead, then how old I was, what was my name, whether I could read, write, and sew a little. Then she touched my cheek gently with her forefinger, observed my ocular gears, and saying she hoped I should be a good child, dismissed me along with Miss Miller. The lady I had left might be about 29. The one who went with me appeared some years younger. The first impressed me by her voice, look, and air. Miss Miller was more ordinary, ruddy in complexion, though of a careworn countenance, hurried in gait and action, like one who had always a multiplicity of tasks on hand. She looked, indeed, what I afterwards found she really was, an under-teacher. Led by her, I passed from compartment to compartment, from passage to passage, of a large and irregular building, till, emerging from the total and somewhat dreary silence pervading that portion of the house we had traversed, we came upon the hum of many voices, and presently entered a wide, long room with great deal tables, 2 at each end, and on each of which burnt a pair of candles, and seated all round on benches a congregation of girls of every age from 9 or 10 to 20. Seen by the dim light of the dips, their number to me appeared countless, though not in reality exceeding 80. They were uniformly dressed in blue tunics over loose white pants, and brown vests buttoned in the front, and some had long plain white scarves wrapped around their shoulders and hair that I would later come to know as a chunny. It was the hour of study. They were engaged in studying over their tomorrow's task, and the hum I had heard was the combined result of their whispered repetitions. Miss Miller signed to me to sit on a bench near the door. Then walking up to the top of the long room, she cried out, "Monitors, collect the lesson books and put them away." 4 tall girls arose from different tables, and going around gathered the books and removed them. Miss Miller again gave the word of command, "Monitors, fetch the supper trays." The tall girls went out and returned presently, each bearing a tray with portions of something I knew not what arranged thereon, and a pitcher of water and mug in the middle of each tray. The portions were handed round. Those who liked took a draught of the water, the mug being common to all. When it came to my turn, I drank, for I was thirsty, but did not touch the food, excitement and fatigue rendering me incapable of eating. I now saw, however, that it was a thin chapati shared into fragments. The meal over, we filed into a shrine room and took our seats as candles and incense were lit. Prayers and chants were read by Miss Miller, and the classes filed off 2 and 2 upstairs. Overpowered by this time with weariness, I scarcely noticed what sort of a place the bedroom was, except that, like the schoolroom, I saw that it was very long. Tonight I was to be Miss Miller's bedfellow. She helped me to undress. When laid down, I glanced at the long rows of beds, each of which was quickly filled with 2 occupants. In 10 minutes the single light was extinguished, and amidst silence and complete darkness I fell asleep. The night passed rapidly. I was too tired even to dream. I only once awoke to hear the wind rave in furious gusts and the rain fall in torrents, and to be sensible that Miss Miller had taken her place by my side. When I again unclosed my eyes, a loud bell was ringing. The girls were up and dressing. Day had not yet begun to dawn, and a rushlight or 2 burned in the room. I too rose reluctantly, and washed when there was a basin at liberty, which did not occur soon, as there was but 1 basin to 6 girls on the stands down the middle of the room. Again the bell rang. All formed in file, 2 and 2, and in that order descended the stairs and entered the humid and dimly lit schoolroom. Here prayers were read by Miss Miller. Afterwards she called out, "Form classes!" A great tumult succeeded for some minutes, during which Miss Miller repeatedly exclaimed, "Shanty!" and "Order!" When it subsided, I saw them all drawn up in 4 semicircles before 4 chairs placed at 4 tables. All held books in their hands, and a great book lay on each table before the vacant seat. At either end of the room, large platforms were pulled in, upon which a variety of large and small machinery were sitting. A pause of some seconds succeeded, filled up by the low, vague hum of numbers. Miss Miller walked from class to class, hushing this indefinite sound. A distant bell tinkled. Immediately 3 ladies entered the room. Each walked to a table and took her seat. Miss Miller assumed the 4th vacant chair, which was that nearest the door, and around which the smallest of the children were assembled. To this inferior class I was called and placed at the bottom of it. Business now began. The day's mantra was repeated and the holy lamp was lit. Then certain texts of scripture were said, and to these succeeded a protracted reading of chapters in the Vedas which lasted an hour. By the time that exercise was terminated, day had fully dawned. The indefatigable bell now sounded for the 4th time. The classes were marshalled and marched into another room to breakfast. How glad I was to behold a prospect of getting something to eat! I was now nearly sick from hunger, having taken so little the day before. The refectory was a great low-ceilinged, gloomy room. On 2 long tables smoked basins of something hot, which, however, to my dismay, sent forth an odour far from inviting. I saw a universal manifestation of discontent when the smell of the food met the nostrils of those destined to swallow it. From the van of the procession, the tall girls of the 1st class rose the whispered words, "Disgusting, the porridge is burnt again." "Silence!" called out a voice, not that of Miss Miller, but one of the upper teachers, a little and dark personage smartly dressed, but of somewhat morose aspect, who installed herself at the top of one table, while a more buxom lady presided at the other. I looked in vain for her I had first seen the night before. She was not visible. Miss Miller occupied the foot of the table where I sat, and a strange foreign-looking elderly lady, the language teacher as I afterwards found, took the corresponding seat at the other board. A long grace was said and a hymn sung, then a servant brought in some tea for the teachers, and the meal began. Ravenous and now very faint, I devoured a spoonful or 2 of my portion without thinking of its taste. But the first edge of hunger blunted, I perceived I had got in hand a nauseous mess. Burnt porridge is almost as bad as rotten potatoes. Famine itself soon sickens over it. The spoons were moved slowly. I saw each girl taste her food and try to swallow it, but in most cases the effort was soon relinquished. Breakfast was over, and none had breakfasted. Thanks being returned for what we had not got, and a second hymn chanted, the refectory was evacuated for the schoolroom. I was one of the last to go out, and in passing the tables, I saw one teacher take a basin of the porridge and taste it. She looked at the others. All their countenances expressed displeasure, and one of them, the stout one, whispered, "Abominable stuff! How shameful!" A quarter of an hour passed before lessons again began, during which the schoolroom was in a glorious tumult. For that space of time it seemed to be permitted to talk loud and more freely, and they used their privilege. The whole conversation ran on the breakfast, which one and all abused roundly. Poor things! It was the sole consolation they had. Miss Miller was now the only teacher in the room. A group of great girls standing about her spoke with serious and sullen gestures. I heard the name of Mr. Brocklehurst pronounced by some lips, at which Miss Miller shook her head disapprovingly, but she made no great effort to check the general wrath. Doubtless she shared in it. It was during this time I finally had a moment to observe the girls that attended this school. I had expected and found a variety of ages and colours. My great surprise arising when I saw a number of my new classmates also fitted with clockwork additions. I observed a classmate with a seeming mechanical glove that replaced specific digits on her hand. Another student stood on one leg that seemed flesh, and the other shone with burnished copper. I observed her discreetly wind some spring at her knee with a key that was attached to her wrist with a cord. Other girls also had clockwork eyes of varying intricacies, but I observed that none were as delicate as mine. Many ocular orbs were held upon the face with leather strapping that crossed their heads. It struck me how expensive my mechanisms must have been, and I resolved to say a prayer for my uncle when next I chanted. A clock in the schoolroom struck 9. Miss Miller left her circle, and standing in the middle of the room cried, "Silence! To your seats!" Discipline prevailed. In 5 minutes the confused throng was resolved into order, and comparative silence quelled the babel clamour of tongues. The upper teachers now punctually resumed their posts, but still all seemed to wait. Ranged on benches down the sides of the room, the 80 girls sat motionless and erect. A quaint assemblage they appeared, all with plain locks combed from their faces, not a curl visible, in salwar kameez, blue tunics over loose white pants, and brown vests buttoned in front with deep work pockets, where each carried pencils, and various delicate tools could be seen poking up, all too wearing simple woven sandals. Above 20 of those clad in this costume were full-grown girls, or rather young women. It suited them ill, and gave an air of oddity even to the prettiest. I was still looking at them, and also at intervals examining the teachers, none of whom precisely pleased me, for the stout one was a little coarse, the dark one not a little fierce, the foreigner harsh, and Miss Miller, poor thing, looked purple, weather-beaten, and overworked. When, as my eye wandered from face to face, the whole school rose simultaneously as if moved by a common spring. What was the matter? I had heard no order given. I was puzzled. Ere I had gathered my wits, the classes were again seated, but as all eyes were now turned to one point, mine followed the general direction, and encountered the personage who had received me last night. She stood at the bottom of the long room on the hearth, for there was a fire at each end. She surveyed the 2 rows of girls silently and gravely. Miss Miller, approaching, seemed to ask her a question, and having received her answer, went back to her place and said aloud, "Monitor of the first class, fetch the globes." While the direction was being executed, the lady consulted moved slowly up the room. I suppose I have a considerable organ of veneration, for I retain yet the sense of admiring awe with which my eyes traced her steps. Seen now in broad daylight, she looked tall and shapely. brown eyes with a kind gaze, and a fine pencilling of long lashes round. On each of her temples her hair, of a very dark black, was clustered in round curls according to the fashion of those times, when neither smooth bands nor long ringlets were in vogue. Her salwar kameez, also in the mode of the day, was of purple cloth. A gold watch shone at her waistcoat. Let the reader add, to complete the picture, refined features, a clear complexion, and a stately air and carriage, and he will have, at least as clearly as words can give it, a correct idea of the exterior of Miss Mandir, Deva Mandir, as I afterwards saw the name written in a prayer book entrusted to me. The superintendent of Lowood, for such was this lady, having taken her seat before a pair of globes placed on one of the tables, summoned the first class round her, and commenced giving a lesson on geography. The lower classes were called by the teachers. Repetitions in history, grammar, and language went on for an hour. Writing and arithmetic succeeded. A few were gathered to be instructed in mechanics resting on the long platforms, and music lessons were given by Miss Mandir to some of the elder girls. The duration of each lesson was measured by the clock, which at last struck 12. The superintendent rose. "I have a word to address to the pupils," said she. The tumult of cessation from lessons was already breaking forth, but it sank at her voice. She went on. "You had this morning a breakfast which you could not eat. You must be hungry. I have ordered that a lunch of roti and cheese shall be served to all." The teachers looked at her with a sort of surprise. "It is to be done on my responsibility," she added in an explanatory tone to them, and immediately afterwards left the room. The roti and cheese was presently brought in and distributed to the high delight and refreshment of the school. The order was now given to the garden, and following the stream I made my way into the open air. The garden was a wide enclosure, surrounded with walls so high as to exclude every glimpse of prospect. A covered veranda ran down one side, and broad walks bordered a middle space divided into scores of little beds. These beds were assigned as gardens for the pupils to cultivate, and each bed had an owner. They were full of flowers and looked quite pretty, but I could not recognize any of the species, as I had never seen them before. I stood and looked round me. It was an inclement day for outdoor exercise, not positively rainy, but darkened by a drizzling fog. All underfoot was still soaking wet with the floods of yesterday. The stronger among the girls ran about and engaged in active games, but sundry pale and thin ones herded together for shelter in the veranda, and amongst these, as the dense mist penetrated to their frames, I heard frequently the sound of a hollow cough. As yet I had spoken to no one, nor did anybody seem to take notice of me. I stood lonely enough, but to that feeling of isolation I was accustomed. It did not oppress me much. I leant against a pillar of the veranda, drew my arms close about me, and trying to forget the wet that clung to me without, and the unsatisfied hunger which gnawed me within, delivered myself up to the employment of watching and thinking. My reflections were too undefined and fragmentary to merit record. I hardly yet knew where I was. Gateshead and my past life seemed floated away to an immeasurable distance. The present was vague and strange, and of the future I could form no conjecture. Under my feet I felt no familiar rumble of steam engine which made me feel the change of scenery more deeply. I looked round the convent-like garden, and then up at the house, a large building, half of which seemed grey and old, the other half quite new. The new part, containing the schoolroom and dormitory, was lit by mullioned and latticed windows, which gave it a church-like aspect. A stone tablet over the door bore this inscription: Lowood Institution. This portion was rebuilt A.D. by Naomi Brocklehurst of Brocklehurst Hall in this county. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. St. Matthew, verse 16. Through selfless service you will always be fruitful and find the fulfillment of your desires. Bhagavad Gita. I read these words over and over again. I felt that an explanation belonged to them and was unable fully to penetrate their import. I was still pondering the signification of institution and endeavouring to make out a connection between the first words and the verses of Scripture, when the sound of a cough close behind me made me turn my head. I saw a girl sitting on a stone bench near. She was bent over a book, on the perusal of which she seemed intent. From where I stood, I could see the title. It was Rasselas, a name that struck me as strange and consequently attractive. In turning a leaf, she happened to look up, and I said to her directly, "Is your book interesting?" I had already formed the intention of asking her to lend it to me some day. "I like it," she answered after a pause of a second or two, during which she examined me. "What is it about?" I continued. I hardly know where I found the hardihood thus to open a conversation with a stranger. The step was contrary to my nature and habits, but I think her occupation touched a chord of sympathy somewhere, for I too liked reading, though of a frivolous and childish kind. I could not digest or comprehend the serious or substantial. "You may look at it," replied the girl, offering me the book. I did so. A brief examination convinced me that the contents were less taking than the title. Rasselas looked dull to my trifling taste. I saw nothing about fairies, nothing about genii, no bright variety seemed to spread over the closely printed pages. I returned it to her. She received it quietly, and without saying anything, she was about to relapse into her former studious mood. Again, I ventured to disturb her. "Can you tell me what the writing on that stone over the door means? What is Lowood Institution? This house where you have come to live? And why do they call it an institution? Is it in any way different from other schools?" "It's partly a charity school. You and I and all the rest of us are charity children. I suppose you are an orphan. Are not either your father or your mother dead?" "Both died before I can remember." "Well, all the girls here have lost either one or both parents, and this is called an institution for educating orphans." "Do we pay no money? Do they keep us for nothing?" "We pay, or our friends pay, £15 a year for each." "Then why do they call us charity children?" "Because £15 is not enough for board and teaching, and the deficiency is supplied by subscription." "Who subscribes?" "Different benevolent-minded ladies and gentlemen." "Who is Naomi Brocklehurst?" "The lady who built the new part of this house, as that tablet records, and whose son overlooks and directs everything here." "Why?" "Because he is treasurer and manager of the establishment." "Then this house does not belong to that tall lady who wears a watch and who said we were to have some roti and cheese?" "To Miss Mandeer? Oh no, I wish it did. She has to answer to Mr. Brocklehurst for all she does. Mr. Brocklehurst buys all our food and all our clothes." "Does he live here?" "No, 2 miles off at a large hall." "Is he a good man?" "He is a clergy pundit and is said to do a great deal of good." "Did you say that tall lady was called Miss Mandeer?" "Yes." "And what are the other teachers called?" "The one with the red cheeks is called Miss Smith. She attends to the work and cutouts, for we make our own clothes, our underclothes, our vests and everything, as well as teaching mechanics. The little one with the black hair is Miss Scatcherd. She teaches history and grammar, and hears the second-class repetitions. And the one who wears the shawl and has a pocket handkerchief tied to her side with a yellow ribbon is Madame Pierrot. She comes from Lille in France and teaches French." "Do you like the teachers?" "Well enough." Do you like them, Madame—" I cannot pronounce her name as you do. "Miss Scatcherd is hasty. You must take care not to offend her. Madame Pierrot is not a bad sort of person." "But Miss Mandeer is the best, isn't she?" "Miss Mandeer is very good and very clever. She is above the rest because she knows far more than they do." "Have you been long here?" 2 years. "Are you an orphan?" "My mother is dead." "Are you happy here?" "You ask rather too many questions. I have given you answers enough for the present. Now I want to read." But at that moment the summons sounded for dinner. All re-entered the house. The odour which now filled the refectory was scarcely more appetizing than that which had regaled our nostrils at breakfast. The dinner was served in 2 huge tin-plated vessels, whence rose a strong stream redolent of rancid fat. I found the mess to consist of indifferent potatoes and strange shreds of rusty meat, mixed and cooked together. Of this preparation, a tolerably abundant plateful was apportioned to each pupil. I ate what I could, and wondered within myself whether every day's fare would be like this. After dinner, we immediately adjourned to the schoolroom. Lessons recommenced and were continued till 5 o'clock. The only marked event of the afternoon was that I saw the girl with whom I had conversed in the veranda dismissed in disgrace by Miss Scatcherd from a history class, and said to stand in the middle of the large schoolroom. The punishment seemed to me in a high degree ignominious, especially for so great a girl. She looked 13 or upwards. I expected she would show signs of great distress and shame, but to my surprise she neither wept nor blushed. Composed, though grave, she stood, the central mark of all eyes. How can she bear it so quietly, so firmly, I asked of myself. Were I in her place, it seems to me I should wish the earth to open and swallow me up. She looks as if she were thinking of something beyond her punishment, beyond her situation, of something not round her nor before her. I have heard of daydreams. Is she in a daydream now? Her eyes are fixed on the floor, but I am sure they do not see it. Her sight seems turned in, gone down into her heart. She is looking at what she can remember, I believe, not at what is really present. I wonder what sort of girl she is, whether good or naughty. Soon after 5 p.m. we had another meal, consisting of a small mug of chai and half a slice of brown bread. I devoured my bread and drank my chai with relish, but I should have been glad of as much more. I was still hungry. Half an hour's recreation succeeded, then study, then the glass of water and the piece of roti, prayers and bed. Such was my first day at Lowood. Chapter 6, in which Jane begins her time at Lowood. The next day commenced as before, getting up and dressing by rushlight, but this morning we were obliged to dispense with the ceremony of washing. The water in the pitchers had become infested with strange insects. A change had taken place in the weather the preceding evening, and a ponderous wind whistling through the crevices of our bedroom windows all night long had brought in heavy low clouds and turned the air hot and muggy. Before the long hour and a half of prayers, chants, and holy books reading was over, I felt ready to perish with hunger. Breakfast time came at last, and this morning the porridge was not burnt. The quality was eatable, the quantity small. How small my portion seemed! I wish it had been doubled. In the course of the day I was enrolled a member of the 4th class, and regular tasks and occupations were assigned me. Hitherto I had only been a spectator of the proceedings at Lowood. I was now to become an actor therein. At first, being little accustomed to learn by heart, the lessons appeared to me both long and difficult. The frequent change from task to task too bewildered me, and I was glad when, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Miss Smith put into my hands a border of muslin 2 yards long, together with needle, thimble, and thread, and sent me to sit in a quiet corner of the schoolroom with directions to hem the same. At that hour most of the others were sewing likewise, but one class still stood round Miss Scatcherd's chair reading, and as all was quiet, the subject of their lessons could be heard, together with the manner in which each girl acquitted herself, and the criticism or commendations of Miss Scatcherd on the performance. It was English history. Among the readers I observed my acquaintance of the veranda. At the commencement of the lesson her place had been at the top of the class, but for some error of pronunciation or some inattention to stops, she was suddenly sent to the very bottom. Even in that obscure position Miss Scatcherd continued to make her an object of constant notice. She was continually addressing to her such phrases as the following: "Burns!" Such it seems was her name. The girls were all called by their surnames, as boys are elsewhere. Burns, you are standing on the side of your sandal. Turn your toes out immediately. Burns, you poke your chin most unpleasantly. Draw it in. Burns, I insist on your holding your head up. I will not have you before me in that attitude. And so on. A chapter having been read through twice, the books were closed and the girls examined. The lesson had comprised part of the reign of Charles I, and there were sundry questions about tonnage and poundage and ship money which most of them appeared unable to answer. Still, every little difficulty was solved instantly when it reached Burns. Her memory seemed to have retained the substance of the whole lesson, and she was ready with answers on every point. I kept expecting that Miss Scatcherd would praise her attention, but instead of that she suddenly cried out, "You dirty, disagreeable girl! You have never cleaned your nails this morning!" Burns made no answer. I wondered at her silence. Why, thought I, does she not explain that she could neither clean her nails nor wash her face as the water was dirty? My attention was now called off by Miss Smith, desiring me to hold a skein of thread. While she was winding it, she talked to me from time to time, asking whether I had ever been at school before, whether I could mark, stitch, knit, etc., till she dismissed me. I could not pursue my observations on Miss Scatcherd's movements. When I returned to my seat, that lady was just delivering an order of which I did not catch the import. But Burns immediately left the class, and going into the small inner room where the books were kept, returned in half a minute carrying in her hand a bundle of twigs tied together at one end. This ominous tool she presented to Miss Scatcherd with a respectful curtsy. Then she quietly and without being told unloosed her vest, and the teacher instantly and sharply inflicted on her neck a dozen strokes with the bunch of twigs. Not a tear rose to Burns's eye, and while I paused from my sewing because my fingers quivered at this spectacle with a sentiment of unavailing and impotent anger, I reached up and touched my ocular winding gear. Not a feature of her pensive face altered its ordinary expression. "Hardened girl!" exclaimed Miss Scatcherd. "Nothing can correct you of your slovenly habits. Carry the rod away." Burns obeyed. I looked at her narrowly as she emerged from the book closet. She was just putting back her handkerchief into her pocket, and the trace of a tear glistened on her thin cheek. The play hour in the evening I thought the pleasantest fraction of the day at Lowood. The bit of bread, the draught of chai swallowed at 5 o'clock had revived vitality, if it had not satisfied hunger. The long restraint of the day was slackened. The schoolroom felt cooler than in the morning, its fires being allowed to burn a little more brightly to supply in some measure the place of candles not yet introduced. The ruddy gloaming, the licensed uproar, the confusion of many voices gave one a welcome sense of liberty. On the evening of the day on which I had seen Miss Scatcherd flog her pupil Burns, I wandered as usual among the forms and tables and laughing groups, without a companion, yet not feeling lonely. When I passed the windows, I now and then lifted a blind and looked out. It rained fast, streams pouring down the panes. Putting my ear close to the window, I could distinguish from the gleeful tumult within the disconsolate sigh of the rain outside. Probably, if I had lately left a good home and kind parents, this would have been the hour when I should most keenly have regretted the separation. That rain would then have saddened my heart. This obscure chaos would have disturbed my peace. As it was, I derived from both a strange excitement, and reckless and feverish I wished the rain to howl more wildly, the gloom to deepen to darkness, and the confusion to rise to clamour. Jumping over forms and creeping under tables, I made my way to one of the fireplaces. There, kneeling by the high wire fender, I found Burns, absorbed, silent, abstracted from all round her by the companionship of a book, which she read by the dim glare of the embers. "Is it still Rasselas?" I asked, coming behind her. "Yes," she said, "and I have just finished it." And in 5 minutes more she shut it up. I was glad of this. Now, thought I can perhaps get her to talk. I sat down by her on the floor. "What is your name besides Burns?" "Helen." Do you come a long way from here? I come from a place farther north, quite on the borders of Scotland. Will you ever go back? I hope so, but no one can be sure of the future. You must wish to leave Lowood. No, why should I? I was sent to Lowood to get an education, and it would be of no use going away until I've attained that object. But that teacher, Miss Scatcherd, is so cruel to you. Cruel? Not at all. She is severe. She dislikes my faults. And if I were in your place, I should dislike her. I should resist her. If she struck me with that rod, I should get it from her hand. I should break it under her nose. Probably you would do nothing of the sort. But if you did, Mr. Brocklehurst would expel you from the school, and that would be a great grief to your relations. It is far better to endure patiently a smart which nobody feels but yourself than to commit a hasty action whose evil consequences will extend to all connected with you. Besides, the Vedas bid us return good for evil. But then it seems disgraceful to be flogged and to be sent to stand in the middle of a room full of people. And you are such a great girl. I am far younger than you, and I could not bear it. Yet it would be your duty to bear it, if you could not avoid it. It is weak and silly to say you cannot bear what it is your fate to be required to bear. I heard her with wonder. I could not comprehend this doctrine of endurance, and still less could I understand or sympathize with the forbearance she expressed for her chastiser. Still, I felt that Helen Burns considered things by a light invisible to my eyes. I suspected she might be right and I wrong, but I would not ponder the matter deeply that day. You say you have faults, Helen. What are they? To me you seem very good. Then learn from me not to judge by appearances. I am, as Miss Scatcherd said, slatternly. I seldom put and never keep things in order. I am careless, I forget rules, I read when I should learn my lessons. I have no method, and sometimes I say, like you, I cannot bear to be subjected to systematic arrangements. This is all very provoking to Miss Scatcherd, who is naturally neat, punctual, and particular. And cross and cruel, I added, but Helen Burns would not admit my addition. She kept silence. Is Miss Mandeer as severe to you as Miss Scatcherd? At the utterance of Miss Mandeer's name, a soft smile flitted over her grave face. Miss Mandeer is full of goodness. It pains her to be severe to anyone, even the worst in the school. She sees my errors and tells me of them gently, and if I do anything worthy of praise, she gives me my meed liberally. One strong proof of my wretchedly defective nature is that even her expostulations, so mild, so rational, have not influence to cure me of my faults, and even her praise, though I value it most highly, cannot stimulate me to continued care and foresight. That is curious, said I. It is so easy to be careful. For you, I have no doubt it is. I observed you in your class this morning, and saw you were closely attentive. Your thoughts never seemed to wander while Miss Miller explained the lesson and questioned you. Now mine continually rove away. When I should be listening to Miss Scatcherd and collecting all she says with assiduity, often I lose the very sound of her voice. I fall into a sort of dream. Sometimes I think I am in Northumberland, and that the noises I hear round me are the bubbling of a little brook which runs through Deepden near our house. Then, when it comes to my turn to reply, I have to be awakened, and having heard nothing of what was read for listening to the visionary brook, I have no answer ready. Yet how well you replied this afternoon. It was mere chance. The subject on which we had been reading had interested me. This afternoon, instead of dreaming of Deepden, I was wondering how a man who wished to do right could act so unjustly and unwisely as Charles I sometimes did. And I thought what a pity it was that with his integrity and conscientiousness he could see no farther than the prerogatives of the crown. If he had but been able to look to a distance and see what they call the spirit of the age was tending. Still, I like Charles. I respect him. I pity him, poor murdered king. Yes, his enemies were the worst. They shed blood they had no right to shed. How dared they kill him? Helen was talking to herself now. She had forgotten I could not very well understand her, that I was ignorant, or nearly so, of the subject she discussed. I recalled her to my level. And when Miss Mandeer teaches you, do your thoughts wander then? No, certainly not often, because Miss Mandeer has generally something to say which is newer than my own reflections. Her language is singularly agreeable to me, and the information she communicates is often just what I wish to gain. Well then, with Miss Mandeer you are good? Yes, in a passive way. I make no effort. I follow as inclination guides me. There is no merit in such goodness. A great deal. You are good to those who are good to you. It is all I ever desire to be. If people were always kind and obedient to those who are cruel and unjust, the wicked people would have it all their own way. They would never feel afraid, and so they would never alter, but would grow worse and worse. When we are struck at without a reason, we should strike back again very hard. I'm sure we should. So hard as to teach the person who struck us never to do it again. You will change your mind, I hope, when you grow older. As yet you are but a little untaught girl. But I feel this, Helen. I must dislike those who, whatever I do to please them, persist in disliking me. I must resist those who punish me unjustly. It is as natural as that I should love those who show me affection, or submit to punishment when I feel it is deserved. Heathens hold that doctrine, but civilized nations disown it. How? I don't understand. It is not violence that best overcomes hate, nor vengeance that most certainly heals injury. What then? Observe what Krishna and Christ say, and how they act. Make their word your rule, and their conduct your example. What do they say? Krishna says, happiness is a state of mind that has nothing to do with the external world. Christ exhorts, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you and despitefully use you. Then I should love Mrs. Reed, which I cannot do. I should be happy despite her son John, which is impossible. In her turn, Helen Burns asked me to explain, and I proceeded forthwith to pour out in my own way the tale of my sufferings and resentments. Bitter and truculent when excited, I spoke as I felt without reserve or softening. Helen heard me patiently to the end. I expected she would then make a remark, but she said nothing. Well, I asked impatiently, is not Mrs. Reed a hard-hearted, bad woman? She has been unkind to you, no doubt, because you see she dislikes your cast of character as Miss Scatcherd does mine. But how minutely you remember all she has done and said to you. What a singularly deep impression her injustice seems to have made on your heart. No ill usage so brands its record on my feelings. Would you not be happier if you tried to forget her severity, together with the passionate emotions it excited? Life appears to me too short to be spent in nursing animosity or registering wrongs. We are, and must be, one and all burdened with faults in this world. But the time will soon come when, I trust, we shall put them off with our bodies and take upon another body with other faults, until we are able to untether our spirit from the earthus, putting off our corruptible bodies, when debasement and ignorance will fall from us with this cumbrous frame of flesh, and only spark of the spirit will remain, the impalpable principle of light and thought, pure as when it left the creators to inspire the creature, whence it came it will return, perhaps again to be communicated to some being higher than man, perhaps to pass through gradations of glory from the pale human soul to brighten to the seraph. Surely it will never, on the contrary, be suffered to degenerate from man to fiend. No, I cannot believe that. I hold another creed which no one ever taught me, and which I seldom mention, but in which I delight, and to which I cling, for it extends hope to all. It makes eternity a rest, a mighty home, not a terror and an abyss. Besides, with this creed I can so clearly distinguish between the criminal and his crime. I can so sincerely forgive the first while I abhor the last. With this creed revenge never worries my heart, degradation never too deeply disgusts me, injustice never crushes me too low. I live in calm, looking to the end. Helen's head, always drooping, sank a little lower as she finished this sentence. I saw by her look she wished no longer to talk to me, but rather to converse with her own thoughts. She was not allowed much time for meditation. A monitor, a great rough girl with one hand of burnished copper, presently came up, exclaiming in a strong Cumberland accent, "Helen Burns, if you don't go and put your drawer in order and fold up your work this minute, I'll tell Miss Scatcherd to come and look at it." Helen sighed as her reverie fled, and getting up, obeyed the monitor without reply as without delay.
Thank you for listening to these chapters of Public Works Steampunk presents Jane Eyre. This book is copyright 2021 by R.A. Harding. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and subscribe so you will be notified when the next chapters are available. The Music Box intro and outro was recorded by Nicholas Drewski. If you would like to read the author's notes on this chapter or order the book, please go to publicworkssteampunk.com, and while you're there, join the mailing list to get a one-of-a-kind infographic about the book and more. Farewell for the present.